Hi, this is Paul. I was reading this book. I mentioned this book in my series on Peugeot's The Language of Creation. Get it in the picture here. And my guess is that somebody out there who watches my videos and leaves comments recommended this book because I'd never heard of it, and I had a sample copy of it in my Kindle collection. And I usually do that when someone recommends a book and there's a sample, so that way I don't have to buy it. So I buy fewer books that I don't get around to reading, and so I just have a sample. And then when I was doing my video on heaven and earth, the hierarchy of heaven and earth came up. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting title. And with an introduction by C.S. Lewis. Wow, that's an interesting book. And so then I went ahead and I bought the whole book and started looking at it. And this book is by D.E. Harding, and it was first published in 1952. Illustrations were drawn by the author, by the Trust in 2011. And then, a couple nights ago, I sat down and I read the preface. And I thought I was watching... I thought I was shocked. 1952. And this is C.S. Lewis's clearest articulation of the meaning crisis that I have read. This book is, I believe, writes Lewis, this is the preface, the first attempt to reverse a movement of thought which has been going on since the beginning of philosophy. The process whereby man has come to know the universe is one from one point of view extremely complicated, from another alarmingly simple. We can observe a single one-way progression. At the outset, the universe appears packed with will, intelligence, life, and positive qualities. Every tree is a nymph, every planet a god. Now, again, we're here with the manifest image, the scientific image. And Lewis doesn't have that language. That language will come along a little bit, probably about the same time in philosophy. But Lewis is saying, and Lewis is also obviously echoing some Barfield here in terms of, these splits, these forks in the road that Lewis notes. And so, on one hand, the universe, at the outset, the universe appears with will, intelligence, life, positive qualities. Every tree is a nymph, every planet a god. Man himself is akin to the gods. The advance of knowledge gradually empties the rich and genial universe. We're talking about, we might say, disenchantment here. The advance of knowledge gradually empties the rich and genial universe, first of its gods, then of its colors, smells, sounds, tastes, and finally of solidity itself, as solidity was originally imagined. As these items are taken from the world, they are transferred to the subjective side of the account. In other words, smells, colors, sounds, tastes, this manifest image goes to the subjective side of the count. So here we have a division between subjective and objective. Classified as our sensations, thoughts, images, or emotions. The subject becomes gorged, inflated at the expense of the object. But the matter does not rest there. The same method which has emptied the world now proceeds to empty ourselves. And when I read that, I thought of how many videos where I talked about the fact that, what is the meaning crisis? Well, first we learn that the world is stranger than we imagine, and then we learn that we are systemic like the world is, and so that pervasive, consuming strangeness, mechanistic attempts to empty the world of the manifest image continues on into us. Let me get rid of this little annoying thing here. There we go. The masters of the method soon announced, that of course is science, the masters of the method soon announced that we were just as mistaken, and mistaken in much the same way when we attributed souls or selves or minds to human organisms, as when we attributed dryads to the trees. Animism apparently begins at home. And if you take a listen to, maybe I'll play it in this video actually, if you listen to Vervaeke's conversation with Sam that I played in the Jordan Peterson commentary, Vervaeke goes into that because John Vervaeke notices that if you read psychology, the self is all over the place, but when asked, well, what are we talking about? Whoosh. Well, we don't really know what we're talking about. Persons. Well, we all know persons, and we're terribly upset that persons' rights are being violated and personhood is being destroyed, and both the right and the left of our political polarity. But then you ask, well, what is a person? Whoosh. It goes away. You bridges of memeing people. I'll give one more for you. Are you ready? Poosh. You can make a meme of that if you want to. Animism apparently begins at home. We who have personified all other things turn out to be ourselves mere personifications. Man is indeed akin to the gods, that is, he is no less phantasmal than they. Just as the dryad is a ghost, an abbreviated symbol for all the facts we know about the tree foolishly mistaken for a mysterious entity above, over and above the facts, so the man's mind or consciousness is an abbreviated symbol for certain verifiable facts about his behavior. A symbol mistaken for a thing. And just as we have been broken of our bad habit of personifying trees, so we must be now broken of our bad habit of personifying men. A reform already effected in the political field. Remember, he's writing this in 1952. There never was a subjective account into which we could transfer the items which the objective had lost. There is no consciousness to contain, as images or private experiences, all the lost gods, colors, and concepts. Consciousness is not the sort of noun that can be used in that way. For we are given to understand that our mistake was a linguistic one. Our previous theologies, metaphysics, and psychologies were a byproduct of our bad grammar. So if we correct the language, well, then we can fix the world, right? Max Muller's formula, mythology is a disease of language, thus returns with a wider scope than we had ever dreamed of. We were not even imagining these things. We were only talking confusedly. All the questions which humanity has hitherto asked with deep concern for the answer turn out to be unanswerable. Not because the answers are hidden from us, like goddess Privité, but because they are nonsense questions like, how far is it from London Bridge to Christmas Day? What we thought we were loving when we loved a woman or a friend was not even a phantom, like a phantom sail which starving sailors think they see on the horizon. It was something more like a pun. And then he adds some Latin that I can't say. It is as though a man deceived by the linguistic similarity between myself and my spectacles should start looking around for his self to put in his pocket before he left his bedroom in the morning. He might want it during the course of a day. If we lament the discovery that our friends have no selves in the old sense, we shall behave like a man who shed bitter tears at being unable to find his self anywhere on the dressing table or even underneath it. And thus we arrive at the result uncommonly like zero. While we were reducing the world to almost nothing, we deceived ourselves with the fancy that all of its lost qualities were being kept safe, if in a somewhat humbled condition, as the things in our own mind. Apparently, we had no mind of the sort required. The subject is as empty as the object. Almost nobody has been making linguistic mistakes about almost nothing. By and large, this is the only thing that has ever happened. Now, the trouble about this conclusion is not simply that it is unwelcome to our emotions. It is not unwelcome to them at all times or in all people. This philosophy, like every other, has its pleasures. And it will, I fancy, prove very congenial to government. Lewis always... The old liberty talk was very mixed up with the idea that, as inside the ruler, so inside the subject, there was a whole world, to him the center of all worlds, capacious of endless suffering and delight. But now, of course, he has no inside except the sort you can find by cutting him open. If I had to burn a man alive, I think I should find his doctrine uncomfortable. The real difficulty for most of us is more like a physical difficulty. We find it impossible to keep our minds, even for 10 seconds in a stretch, twisted into the shape that this philosophy demands. And to do him justice, Hume, who is its great ancestor, warned us not to try. He recommended backgammon instead, and freely admitted when, after a suitable dose, we return to our theory, we should find it cold and strained and ridiculous. And obviously, if we really must accept nihilism, that is how we shall have to live. Just as, if we had diabetes, we must take insulin. If one would rather not have diabetes and do without the insulin, if there should, after all, turn out to be any alternative to philosophy that can be supported only by repeated and presumably increasing doses of backgammon, I suppose that most people would be glad to hear of it. There is indeed, or so I am told, one way of living under this philosophy without the backgammon, but it is not one a man would like to try. I have heard that there are states of insanity in which such a nihilistic doctrine becomes readily credible. That is, as Dr. I.A. Richards would say, belief feelings are attached to it. The patient has an experience of being nobody in a world of nobodies and nothings. Those who return from this condition describe it as highly disagreeable. Now, there is, of course, nothing new in the attempt to process that. Now, there is nothing new in the attempt to arrest the process that has led us from the living universe, where man meets the gods, to the final void, where almost nobody discovers his mistakes about almost nothing. Every step in that process has been contested. Many rearguard actions have been fought, some of them fought at the moment. But it has only been a question of arresting, not of reversing the moment. That is what makes Mr. Harding's book so important. If it works, then we shall have seen the beginning of a reversal. Not a stand here or a stand there, but a kind of thought which attempts to reopen the whole question. And we feel sure in advance that the only thought of this type can help. The fatal slip which has led us to nihilism must have occurred at the very beginning. There is, of course, no question of returning to animism, as animism was before the rot began. No one supposed that the belief of pre-philosophic humanity, just as they stood before they were criticized, can or should be restored. The question is whether the first thinkers, in modifying, and rightly modifying, them under criticism, did not make some rash and unnecessary concession. It was certainly not their intention to commit us to the absurd consequences that have actually followed. The sort of error is, of course, very common in debate, or even in our solitary thought. We start with a view which contains a good deal of truth, though in a confused or exaggerated form. Objections are then suggested, and we withdraw it. But hours later, we discover that we have emptied the baby out with the bath, and that the original view must have contained certain truths for lack of which they are now entangled in absurdities. So here, in emptying out the dryads and the gods, which admittedly would not do just as they stood, we appear to have thrown out the whole universe, ourselves included. We must go back and begin over again. this time with a better chance of success. For, of course, we can now use all particular truths and all improvements of method which our argument may have thrown up as byproducts in its otherwise ruinous course. It would be affectation to pretend that I know whether Mr. Harding's attempt in its present form will work. Very possibly not. And given the fact that the book seems to be obscure, at least it was lost to me, and has never come up in any of our discussions, it appears to be a failure. I've only read a chapter or two of the book. It's a very interesting book, but I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Not wholly unlike the fact that when I was first introduced to the work of the Peugeot brothers, I wasn't quite sure what to make of that work either. We are all sort of trapped in the worlds that we have inherited and the projections that we can foist upon them. One expects the first or the 21st rocket to the moon will make a good landing. Now this, of course, was almost 20 years before the moon landing. But it is a beginning. If it should turn out to have been even the remote ancestor of some system which will give us again a credible universe inhabited by credible agents and observers, this will still have been a very important book indeed. It has also given me that bracing and satisfying experience which, in certain books of theory, seem to be partially independent of our final agreement or disagreement. It is an experience most eagerly disengaged by remembering what has happened to us whenever we turned from the inferior exponent of a system, even a system we reject, to its great doctors. I have had it in turning from common existentialist to Monsieur Sartre himself, from the Calvinists to the Institutio, from the Transcendentalists to Emerson, from books about Renaissance Platonism to Ficino. One may still disagree. I disagree heartily with all the authors I have just named. But one now sees, for the first time, why anyone did agree. One has breathed a new air, become free of a new country. It may be a country you cannot live in, but you now know why the natives love it. You will henceforth see all the systems a little differently because you have been inside that one. And if you go back to my question and answer 2 weeks ago, we talked about the inside view with the outside view, which is, of course, Lewis, the reflections from the tool shed, looking at the light or looking through the light. You'll henceforth see all the systems a little differently because you have been inside that one. From this point of view, philosophies have some of the same qualities as works of art. I'm not referring at all to the literary art with which they may or may not be expressed. It is I should have learned Latin. It is the ipsetas, the peculiar unity of effect produced by a special balancing and patterning of thoughts and classes of thought. A delight very much like which was given by Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, which if you go back to my earlier conversations with Ron Dart, we talked about. And Ron Dart was very excited about it, and I didn't know anything about it. And I still don't know much about it. But here's Lewis bringing it up and kind of points me to, okay, well, maybe I'm going to have to read The Glass Bead Game, which is all about the academy and philosophies and such, in the book of that name, which Lewis gives us in German, if it could really exist. I owe a new experience of that kind to Mr. Harding. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm going to just post this as a video as such, because I think this is a really interesting point of seeing how Lewis saw the meaning crisis very clearly in 1952 and wrote about it in a very interesting way in a book I had never heard of. And so I want people to find it. So I'm going to make a little video of just this, and then I'm going to keep talking about it. And I'm going to post that video tomorrow, and you can find that tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. on the channel. And we'll have question and answer at 10 a.m. or I'll post it at 6 a.m. on the channel, and we'll have question and answer at 10 a.m. As we usually do on Fridays. So as I said at the end of the previous video, I wanted to get that element of the book out there because I think it wasn't last night, it was the night before when I opened up this book and I started reading the introduction by Lewis. Again, I was just sort of shocked because of how it summarily wrapped up in a very intelligible way the meaning crisis. But then I continued to think about it. I had more thoughts, and I wanted to get the contents of the book out there as such in its own video before I start digging into it. And so this is the diggings. So John and Christopher Mastropietro did an outstanding video about the symptomology of the meaning crisis, and those two should probably redo that video post-COVID with better sound, because it was an outstanding video. And when they start walking through these things, the symptomologies of this, it's like, okay, well, what's going on now? What's fascinating about us is that we suffer from things we're not aware of. And we're suffering from things that are certainly immaterial. Because if you read Lewis is about as capable as anyone of articulating something that is difficult to articulate at all. So we find ourselves in the demythologizing of the world to demythologize ourselves, hence causing a meaning crisis. That there is no I, and I thought Lewis put that in an amazing way. I am a symbol. Myself is a symbol. Paul Vanderklay is a symbol. And someone might say, no, you're a carbon being wrapped in skin that has the experience of consciousness, but any agency or meaning that you employ is simply illusory. And, if you look at Sam Harris's conversation with Brett Weinstein, that's Sam's take. But as Lewis points out, Sam would be horribly offended if you actually treated him according to his definition of who he is. And again, this is what Peterson points out again and again, and, well, we don't seem to get it. So here's the irony that we vote up the hierarchy people who tell us we're nothing. What is going on? And all of this nothingness is completely immaterial, and it's on the lips of materialists. So what is going on? Now, let's talk about the meaning crisis a little bit. Let's assume that it's real. And once we use that word real, we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by real? Because it's certainly not physical. And it certainly seems to be causal. That is the premise. That is the assertion. That is what's going on in all of these conversations, that not only is this meaning crisis, that's a label that we put on whatever it is, not only is it real, it's also causal. It causes things like depression, drug addiction, reciprocal narrowing. We can use all of those words. And it's causal on a non-physical plane. Well, is that true? Well, you might say, so Sam Harris likes to use this word intersubjective, and that's not a bad word, but where is it located? And of course, one of the real questions asked Peterson was fairly early on in the biblical series in his first wave. If all human beings were to be eradicated, would God go with them? In other words, is God merely existing in the intersubjective? This gets more complex when you get into really the work of a lot of Peterson's assertion that, well, in terms of this intersubjective goes back before whatever date you want to put on the emergence of Homo sapiens. Okay, so the whole joke about the lobster is that the intersubjective is actually there with the lobsters, and so therefore it's older than the trees. Okay. So if you got rid of all the lobsters, would you get rid of the intersubjective? Well, of course, not just all the lobsters, but all of the sentient beings, etc., etc. So we're dealing with historical causality and psychological causality. And again, none of us are going to act like this is physical. In fact, when we look at the physical, this is where we get into weird space, because is the physical causing the intersubjective, or is the intersubjecting causing the physical? And this is where you get into this Vervaekean space of not here nor there, but between and back and forth. And I mean, all of those, and we certainly understand that element of it, because that seems right. The physical can certainly cause that. There is a nexus between the physical and the intersubjective, as Sam Harris would call it. And part of it is not just only the element of it being live, but the element of it being stored, and the element of it being mapped. Okay, and so now we're using some language from Jordan here. Maps of meaning, because all of these mappings are in us, and not only are these mappings of an unknown land, but then the maps themselves begin to function within the intersubjective, and the difference between the truth of the unknown land and the mappings themselves becomes an element of the conversation and continues to go up. And of course, Jordan Peterson would talk about how this then, Jordan likes to point to, mating practices of human beings. This then gets into the gene pool. And so you've just got colonization all around. But again, I want to come back to the idea that now we are suffering from something that we are not aware of. And then we have this insight. And of course, John Vervaeke talks a lot about insight. We have insights when we see a mapping of this, and we begin to say, oh, that's what's going on with me. Okay. And I want to sort of bring back Lewis in here, because Lewis, of course, starts at a far earlier place of dryads and gods and myths and all of that. Oh, we hear the myth. That's what's going on with me. And of course, the relationship between the myth and the religion is, once you have a map, well, now you can begin to navigate along the map. Once you have a god, now you can relate to the god. Once you have the animism, now you can relate to the spirits of the trees. Now, again, as I read at the end of that, Lewis is not saying we go back to animism. In fact, it is Lewis's learnings in this that drives him into the Christianity that he promoted. I had a series of tweets this morning, because yesterday Neil Shenvi noted that the book Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, by Kristen Kobes-Dumay, who I had on my channel because she's a professor of history at Calvin College, and I got my undergraduate degree in history at Calvin College, and the Christian Reformed Church is a small denomination, and I love the institute that I left. I love Calvin College. I want to be loyal. I want to be friendly. I want to do all of that. And she and I have mutual friends that go to the same church, and so it's a small community. So we did a conversation, and maybe on this channel I'll do a little bit more critiquing of the book. I decided not to do a lot of critiquing of the book in my conversation with her, because I very much, when I read the book, understood how this book plays out in my little subculture of the Christian Reformed Church. And especially for those outside of it, I wanted people to understand her story, because just like with everything we do, her story goes into the book. And so I'm just having a normal day on Twitter, and Neil Shenvi mentions this, and I sent out a couple tweets, and he sent out a couple tweets, and before you know it, there was an avalanche of people that were basically on Neil Shenvi, upset with him, basically because there's a mapping. There's a political mapping. And this is where sort of political mappings and meaning comes into play. If you follow Jordan Peterson's admonition, do what is meaningful and not what is expedient, many of those people that wanted to correct or just basically antagonize or challenge, however you want to frame it, all of those people that wanted to talk to Neil Shenvi about this in sort of a Oh, see, it's we don't even have the language for what we do, but all of you know exactly what I'm talking about. But yet, so we have these worldviews of these grand maps, these grand worldviews, and we feel, our interactions with them are incredibly meaningful. And of course, a lot of that is again what Jordan's work is about. I'm so dyslexic. I don't know which side of me I am when I look in these screens, because in one screen it's over here and the other screen it's over there. I'm a mess. Anyway, Peterson's great axiom: no one likes getting poked in the axiom. And so Peterson, of course, writes maps of meaning when he watches this playing out on a global scale with the Cold War, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Now, in the woke wars, even unintentionally defying obscure implicit mappings is raised to the level of violence. And so we're a very sensitive, very subtle, very reactive people, especially in a space like Twitter. I asked the question, what is Twitter? Why can Twitter be a cesspool? Why do we use that word to describe it? This is, again, Vervaekian relevance realization. Where's the intersection between this online social media that itself is hardly physical and a cesspool, which is a very physical thing, a very smelly thing? Why do we relate these two things? Twitter doesn't make itself a cesspool, although the design and algorithm enable that for status reasons. I mean, so we're playing all these little status hierarchy games. It's in the intersubjective. Truth is, we make Twitter a cesspool. So Neil Shenvi is going to review a book by Kristen Dumais. That's a good thing, even if Neil disagrees with it. My critique of the book isn't terribly positive either, but that's the game you play in book writing, blogging, or video making. Adults understand this. So lots of peeps jumped on Neil for being honest about his biases. I was a bit surprised. Neil is by now very used to it because, and you can hear his story there, and I didn't even finish the tweet. Kristen Dumais has a story too. You can hear hers on my channel. I know it's unusual in this space, but the reason I do these long bios with public figures is because their controversial work flows out of their lived experience. I mean, that's supposed to be the whole epistemology of, a certain postmodernity. The video I might make today has to do with some of these dynamics. We all have mappings on a non-physical world that we're deeply invested in. It's a very strange thing, especially if you think you're a materialist. It is important that we debate hard entities in this mapped immaterial world. And again, I really like the quip that Peterson says that, it's better that our ideas die than we die. So we should go very hard at these ideas, but I think as a Christian, continue to love the idea holders. And figuring out how to do that is really, really hard for us, I think partly because the reality of the idea holders is deeply connected to the ideas. And that tells us something about what a human being is. And if you can sort of ponder that, it can go very deep. It's important that we debate hard entities in this mapped immaterial world. There are powers here far beyond us that bring us goodness and misery. It really is what spiritual means. And that's really what I was thinking about as I was working through this stuff. And then I threw in this other little meme that I found on Twitter, this little GIF that is really, really helpful. Here you have these two dogs that are looking like they're going to kill each other on the side of a fence, and then you roll the gate open and they're just nice and kind and loving, and then you push it back and they want to kill each other, and then you roll it back the other way and they're nice and kind and gentle, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Now, a lot of that gets to a lot of the points that John Vervaeke makes, that there are systems. Lewis understood you can't just go back. There are these forks that happen in the road. One of them is the subjective and the objective, that mapping. And so you're not going to dispel that mapping. Wind and spirit and the Barfield stuff. You're not just going to dispel these forks. But this is the world that we're living in, and we're going to have to figure out what to do with this. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is understand this language. And again, Lewis takes this on and says, well, what we're doing is we're misusing language. And Lewis is basically critiquing that idea, because Lewis is saying there's a lot more at play here. And what Vervaeke and Peterson, I think, highlight is yes, and the response to them. We're trying to understand what we mean by religion and what we mean by spiritual. And I won't name him, but someone in the Bridges of Meaning community made this little meme. You've got Jordan Peterson saying to Sam Harris, "You can't not be a Christian, Sam, because you're still acting it out." You've got Eric Weinstein saying to Sam, "You can't not be in the IDW, Sam, because you're still acting it out." And then poor Sam has to figure out, what do I do now? And in some ways, that's where we're at with this stuff. And I know people get annoyed when I talk about the fact that we are deeply secular and deeply impacted by materialism, and we are deeply, in fact, postmodern in ways that are inevitable. We are now what language can we use to map this out? And I find New Testament language deeply helpful in that we are under the power of what? And I think the best language for that is, in fact, the language of religion and spirituality. We've got a religious and spiritual landscape that operates causally upon us, just like the meaning crisis operates causally upon us. Theology obviously operates in this sphere, as does philosophy. In other words, we act out things that we don't map, or haven't mapped, or in some cases can't map. And partly what we see in human beings is that some map better than others, some are aware better than others. Even if you're mapped, you may or may not be able to do anything about it, because your actions are built into you. And so a lot of what religion is about is getting intentional with certain mappings and certain traditions of mappings. And when you look at John Vervaeke's project, and his is in many ways a similar thing, bringing these mappings to awareness and get to do better. Now, again, to get into the better and worse stuff, that was an interesting segment of the Peterson-Peugeot conversation, because Peterson, I think quite rightly, points to, well, once you start using that word better, and again, Sevilla just posted a video this morning with stuff about McGilchrist. So all of these things are coming together. And so Sevilla's work on Persig about value, I found that to be quite interesting and helpful, enlightening in this. We're mostly obtuse and often wrong about this spiritual world. And again, so when atheists use the word spiritual, what do they mean? Now, I'm not trying to be a jerk in this, because it's fun to catch Christians using the word and asking them what they mean. And sometimes people catch me in my own game using the word and say, "No, what do you mean by that?" And this is what we're trying to figure out. This is what we're trying to figure out about how the world works. And now, awareness is not power. What did I mean by that? We've got limited power in the spiritual world as we do in our psychological effects about ourselves. So sit down with your therapist, and in that moment, in that little box that the therapist works in, you recognize and confess to your therapist that there's something that you do which is somehow against your better judgment, and you'd really like to stop, but you don't quite know how to stop. And then suddenly we're transported back to Romans 7, and the good that I would do, I don't do, and what the Apostle Paul has to say. And so all of this stuff just maps on us, and we don't quite know what to do with it. Now, I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for Jordan's reaction to Christianity and the church. And I'm not doing that to call out Christianity and the church. That same frustration I have with myself. You know, when I preach to my congregation, if you really believed this stuff, your life would be different. I'm preaching to myself. And part of what's dramatic about Peterson's transparent reflections on these things is that you get the sense that he, better than many, have an appreciation for, if he really did embody, if he really was virginal in the way that Jonathan Pageau talks about virginality, what would happen? And I talked about this quite a bit in my long videos and my commentaries, and some of that's going to come out in my sermon this week, as these things usually do. But you know, this is what we're talking about. This is what religion grapples with. And it's not just grappling on a personal level. I think what we're seeing is that the very long process, causal process that Nietzsche identified, the very long death of God, is working its way through our culture. And the reason we have such difficulty getting on the same page, even just look at that language, getting on the same page politically, is because our worlds are drastically different from each other. And I just got to play this meme. So those crafty meme makers in the Bridges of Memeing channel.
Okay, that response should work.
Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson walking an NPC across a river to an Orthodox church, while an Orthodox song is going on in the background. And I didn't see it early on, but when they first go, you hear the voice of Sam Harris sort of calling them out as they go. We are strange creatures. I mean, look at this. Someone would say, well, did this really happen? And others would say, no, it's happening all the time. And then others will say, well, you know,
is part of the problem.
How is Jordan taking him when Jordan doesn't even go there? And, you know, why is Sam on the shore? And. Someone left a really good comment. Nathan Gale left a really good comment on the videos, and from a Mormon perspective. And great video, Pastor. Your conversations with Jonathan Pageau, trying to reconcile your doctrinal differences as much as you can, have been really inspiring to me. I'm a Mormon, but I kind of consider myself Catholic too, due to my parents' mixed faith background. So ecumenism is very important to me. Of course, Mormonism is still considered sort of a fringe Christianity, so it's not easy to be an ecumenical Mormon. I spend quite a lot of brain power reconciling what Joseph Smith said about the nature of God with what the Council of Nicaea declares. To my Catholic friends' surprise, I've gotten to the point that I can recite the Catholic Orthodox Creed without holding back spiritually or intellectually. And you know, it was a great comment, and I really appreciated the comment because, yeah. So I've said before in this channel, I have a lot of skepticism about the origin story of the LDS Church. Others have a lot of skepticism about the origin story of Christianity. Others have a lot of skepticism about the origin of dryads and gods and so we're disputing maps. It was noted that Jordan asked John on Twitter if they'd like to have a conversation. I got to it late, but I know John doesn't look at his Twitter feed too much, I don't think, which is probably wise, because I'll tell you, that cesspool of Twitter sucks me into it sometimes, and I leave sort of feeling I need to take a shower and finding someone to confess my sins to, my Twitter sins. And Nate, who's been on the channel a couple of times, and last time Nate was on the channel, we talked about that, and Nate said, "You need to be more critical, Jordan. It seems to me like Vervaeke is starting a cult. The Discord server has some particularly bad pseudo-intellectuals on it." And then I stuck up for John. So here I am. I feel that it's very meaningful for me to stick up for John because some sense of right and wrong has been violated. And, I even think back of how I started. Strawn, said you should watch John Vervaeke, and some of my early critiques of John's work. I think they were fairly low resolution and maybe not entirely fair. But once I got to know John, my goodness, what a lovely human being John is. At least to me, and I'm sure he's got his, we all got our dark sides. So I said, hardly. John is about the sweetest, most fair guy you're going to find. He's got a nerdy following, yes, but unlike a cult, he's in no way manipulative or controlling. And if you want to go back, my first conversation with Mary Cohen, who John has spoken with a number of times, was about cults. And Mark had a conversation with Mary, and Manuel had a conversation with Mary, and someone might say, yeah, those Catholics, they're cultish. And Mary would say, not exactly like the Jehovah's Witnesses I was a part of. So here we are disputing maps. And again, I think it's very good for us to dispute maps. I think disputing maps is part of the process. And Nate says you should try disagreeing with the in-group to see how culty it is. Well, I can understand that. And see, part of the problem is now I have some status, and status gets into this game because people might, behind my, so sometimes Rick and I, after our question and answer things, we're working on stuff at church, but we've got the Twitter chatter on, and sometimes people say things about me when they think I'm not there, and they're not necessarily very nice things. And part of me likes to hear it. It's not always pleasant to hear it, but it's good to hear it because at least I know. And it's actually information. And the book of Proverbs talks about this all the time, that, your critics can be your friends because we've all got these mappings of ourselves and we're not very good at them. And you're accepting the stuff they're putting out there, so you haven't had to confront pseudo-intellectuals like someone that he names, but rather you've been a tool for him to gratify his narcissism. Oh my. Well, that's... maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I certainly have plenty of narcissism within me. People maybe want to colonize me to get greater status, to get their ideas out there, that's how human beings work. And now we're right there in the middle of the meaning crisis, what C.S. Lewis wrote about, because, well, am I just doing these videos because I'm a narcissist and I like watching myself? I like seeing myself, and I'm hooked on the analytics and I want to go up further, and so anything that was said of Mark could very much and has been said of me. I've certainly read those comments, and for me, this doesn't necessarily, well, it triggers something of a meaning crisis, but it also, if there's, as Jordan Peterson says, sort of a not an ideology, but sort of a full body religion back there, I can look at all of these ugly things about myself, my narcissism, my self-centered biases, my neediness for affirmation, my desire to colonize the world with all of my ideas, my defensiveness for the things that for the things that I value, and my defensiveness for my axioms when you poke me in them. All of that along the background of actually a religion that has a lot of language to address these things. And as Jonathan Peugeot noted, in terms of his relationship with his priest, a practice to address these things. Now, part of what happened in Protestantism is that confession, because of the priesthood of all believers, the church sort of breaks the monopoly on that, and there's good things about that and bad things about that. But maybe you all are my confessors now, and you don't necessarily have to learn how to hold confidence because I'm putting it out on YouTube. And I'm not going to confess everything to you, but there are plenty of things in me that certainly need confession. John is a nice guy, by the way. That's a proposition I believe. I believe John's views to be honestly mistaken, and that there are good parts people can take, but it's also straddling a danger zone. So he's got concerns about it, and certainly I do too. And I told him I'm happy to do a video with Nathan and Mark if Mark would like to. And I'd probably actually like to bring in Iron Root or Manuel, who has been part of our Discord, because So Manuel hung out with the Christians, and that was sort of instrumental for him finding the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord, and that was instrumental in him, getting some discipline in his life and helping him fix up his life and do better in his life. And I actually should probably bring up this Twitter thread, because it goes on, because John and I have hosts of disagreements. I'm a theist. He's a non-theist. I have a lot of utility for telos and eschatology, and he sort of resists them. And these come up regularly in our talks, and the emanation versus emergence, and often poor John, it's sort of 2-on-1, or it's really Peugeot on one side, Vervaeke on the other side, and me sort of in the middle, trying to maybe understand them both and talk out loud as I'm trying to understand them to maybe help you understand them. But also, I'm a Protestant, so I'm just kind of in the middle of a lot of these things, and that's how it goes. But the ability to talk about them, and what does that require in order for it to do well? There's so many ironies in this. I find a deep security. And I find that for me is one of the things my religion offers me, because in the midst of this meaning crisis, and, Lewis has a point there, because the more I have to recognize the validity of, a lot of John's cognitive science, that God, there are these processes in me. But then historically, there are all these processes around me, or if I speak for those of you north of the border, processes. They're all around me. In fact, they go way back to the lobsters. And then suddenly I have a question, is there any me here actually? But there is a me here, and we value the individual in the system. And it's one of the things that Jordan brings out. And so even to have any video that is interesting enough to watch requires difference in it, dissonance. One of the first lessons I learned at Calvin Seminary, one of my best classes, was a class on teaching, not preaching, but teaching. And I've probably used that teaching class more in my preaching than any of the preaching classes I took, because you have to raise dissonance. But it's often the case that in my sermons I raise dissonance, and you need to raise just enough dissonance so that you gain interest, but not too much dissonance so that people go over the top. And you're talking to a large group of people, so a certain number of those people go over the top, and you just want to find exactly the right place to just hold them right in that zone where it's going to be productive. And of course, John has all this language to talk about that. And so, so Nathan feels that there's danger here. And then someone then came in and basically said, well, Nathan's been very open with his life. He told his story on my channel. Well, Nathan's got all of these hang-ups and trip-ups from the way he was formed in his life. And, that may be so. We all have those things, because none of us came out of a pure family or a pure system. But then you have to ask the question, what do you do for that? And so then I posted the little clip that I had played in the video of John Vervaeke talking about agape, because when I first watched that video, I thought, here I am, a Christian minister, and here this guy who is post-Christian and sort of walked away from Christianity because of things in his past, is explaining agape in a way that I've never been able to achieve. And, I had that same experience with Jordan Peterson, obviously, because he was doing things that I look at and say, I should be doing that, and I can't. Why not? Now there's an insecurity of our maps that arise, and well, what's wrong with my Dutch Calvinism, and what's wrong with my Christianity, and so that's why all of this has to come from a deep place of security. And one might ask, well, how can you have that security? And there are many answers, of course. Many have noted that probably part of it's just by virtue of my biology. I'm very low in negative emotions. Part of it is probably because of the parenting. My father and mother were both very secure people, deeply committed to their religious tradition, enormously altruistic people, gave, the majority of their lives to in service of others. Tammy Peterson's, the last 10, 15 minutes of her conversation with Michaela were just beautiful, and Tammy testified to that. And so then there's that. And then there's my religious tradition that I'm built on, and part of Calvinism, for, every religious tradition has its upsides and downsides in terms of its mappings. But part of what Calvinism has really offered me is a sort of security that, what is my only comfort in life and in death? First question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism. I am not my own, but I belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ, who has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood and has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. This gives me a deep security that I can have bad ideas and wrong theology, and even sometimes sinfully promote them on YouTube for others to maybe pick up themselves, and I'll have to answer for those kinds of things. But there's a security that, what does it afford? It affords a deep love of God. And I was very moved listening to Tammy Peterson talk about, in her own way, she got it from the Lord's Prayer, because she got the rosary from someone who was a Roman Catholic, and she now prays using the rosary, and she prays that bit of the Lord's Prayer, not my will, but thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And of course you have the Garden of Gethsemane, and I can't talk to a Mormon and not think about and my friend has disappeared, but my homeless friend who has taught me a lot. Taught me a lot about the LDS Church and Mormonism. That place of deep security is a vital place if we're going to navigate the disputed territories in our maps. And part of the reason, especially for a first conversation, I don't go right to the disputes is because I want us to share, and I want us to find some places in common on our maps. And I want us to find ways that we can establish a relationship. And it's part of the reason Twitter becomes such a cesspool. It's too brief. And Michaela made the comment at the end of that video that YouTube is really a wonderful place for long form conversations where, you know, we're only seeing each other little by little through these screens, but at least there's more here than Twitter. Last night in our men's Bible study, it was my turn to lead it, and we had the parable of not the parable, but the story of the Canaanite woman's great faith. Jesus disputed. He absolutely did. Did Jesus always dispute? No. And so part of what my religious tradition affords me is this person to follow. And it's not just an imaginative relationship with Jesus. I certainly have that. But there's a text involved. And one of the most controversial stories from the New Testament lately is Jesus' interchange with this Canaanite woman. And I gave a lot of explanation about how this Canaanite woman, who was Jesus to this Canaanite woman? Was this Canaanite woman a polytheist? And I talked about the fact that all of Jesus' miracles are always contextualized. And Jesus understood the contextuality of his miracles. And in fact, he often resisted the crowd when they resisted the contextuality of his miracles. That his miracles were really very much enacted sermons. They were manifestations of something spiritual. And so Jesus was hard on this woman, but then at the end of it declares her great faith. And part of what I pressed to my group my Bible study was that there's an enormous word of good news in this, because we all have these mappings with lots of errors. And we would imagine that this Canaanite woman had mappings with lots of errors. My daughter is severely possessed by a demon. Jesus didn't answer a word, and the disciples came up and said, "Send her away because she's crying out to us. She's annoying us." Jesus seems to be just trying to get on a little bit of a break. And she came and knelt down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered. He didn't say, "Oh, okay." And he answered and said, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And I really leaned into my group and say, you have to pause on that and think that through deeply. Not just, oh, Jesus is a bigot. Oh, Jesus is a misogynist. Oh, those, okay. Well, say it if you want to. But if you actually dig down into it, you'll begin to understand and learn something. And so she said, "Yes, Lord." She didn't take offense. Maybe she did, but she held it in her mapping. "Yes, Lord, for even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall on the master's table." Everyone remembers the dog comment, but nobody remembers, "Woman, your faith is great." Why didn't Jesus see her great faith before he dismissed her? Maybe he did. You don't know. I don't know. Well, maybe it was Jesus' dismissal of her that made her faith great. "Let it be done for you as you want," and her daughter was healed from that hour. And I've had a lot of thoughts about demonic possession along the lines of what I'm working on in terms of what we mean by spiritual. And again, that's why, for me, my favorite biblical Peterson analogy is the is the unauthorized exorcist of the Gospel of Mark. But here this woman has all the wrong ideas. And her persistent pursuit of Jesus leads not only to his affirmation of her faith. I asked the group, I said, let's imagine lots of people wanted miracles from Jesus. Let's imagine Jesus understood modern bureaucracy like we have it. And so Jesus has an application process for the people most worthy of his miracles, the one who would best understand his contextuality. And so everybody fills in all of these applications talking about all of their theology and their philosophy and how they're getting everything right. This woman wouldn't come near the top of that pile in terms of whether she would qualify for a miracle, but her need and her persistent pursuit of that need and her dogged pursuit of Jesus leads her into a place where her daughter is healed of possession and her faith is praised and validated by Jesus. And what happens after this moment, we don't know. But the story there is the message. And so, well, how should I live? Well, I live by trying to follow Jesus. And I've been thinking about the fact that, well, a lot of people are working on things without Jesus. And, okay, what does Jesus afford us? So Jonathan Peugeot and I can differ on a lot of things, but we're both pointing to Jesus, and we're both looking at the text. Let's give Protestantism its due too. And somehow in Jesus we are united. Well, what does that mean? We barely know. But at least it's a fixed point. At least it's something to orient better with. Jesus could dispute. Jesus didn't always dispute. When did Jesus dispute and when did he let things pass? Well, part of the reason he was killed is he was letting things pass, justice things about. So I tried also to the group to emphasize. So one of our group, I've let some non-Living Stones people into the group. I'm really careful with that because I don't want to swamp the group. And so one of our group members is from Australia. And I wanted, when we see the Canaanite woman from Tyre and Sidon, it just washes over us. It means nothing to us. It's not on our maps. And I said, well, let's imagine China invaded Australia for the natural resources. It's not a crazy thought. China is this enormous power with an enormous population. Australia has fewer people than the state of California. Not a huge military. Australia relies on the United States to hold China at bay. Let's imagine, you can play this out historically, Japan and Korea. Let's imagine that China invades Australia and Chinese officers start taking slaves of Australian boys, girls, and women. How would an Aussie feel about that? How would you feel about the Chinese? You'd have one heck of a culture war going on. And then a Chinese officer asks a favor of a village for one of the slaves that was taken from that village. There's justice issues involved there, aren't there? Justice issues that are at least as profound as many of the justice issues we have today. And they're not just sort of in our intersubjective maps. They're laying right there in front. These are the sinners Jesus engages regularly. Tax collectors and prostitutes are collaborators with the unjust occupational force. We tend to glaze over sinners. I'm preaching on Luke 15 this week. We tend to glaze over sinners or recast them in terms of good sinners from the 1960s counterculture. Oh, we like sinners, really? Until you don't. A lot of relevance realization going there. I think this is my last slide. Yeah. And so how to navigate through this stuff, how to navigate through this meaning crisis, how to deal with the fact that, as C.S. Lewis says, sometimes I'm nobody and nothing, talking to other nothings. I find myself in Christ. That's an awfully big thing. And in Christ, I have identity. And the identity I have in Christ, I think, says the Apostle Paul, is more profound than my identity as a male, than my identity as white. It's the most foundational identity I can have. Well, why would you say that? Because it will endure. Well, how will it endure? Well, we will see. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. So, yeah, I don't know if you're happy you came back for the rest of this rambly video or not, but we live in a weird world. We act in very strange ways. We've got all of these disputes, and maybe if we do so well, we can learn something, and we can find some community, and we can find some joy. And we can learn how to navigate in this world, make it a better place, and learn to love one another.